Picture the room the way the railroad sold it to you. White linen pulled tight across the table. Heavy silver, polished until it throws the light back at you. A fresh rose, standing in a little vase that somehow never tips over, no matter how the car sways. Outside the window, the countryside is unspooling its speed. Farms and rivers and telegraph poles blurring past, and a waiter in a starched white jacket sets down a five-course meal that appears as if by magic. Plate after plate, hot and perfect, while the whole world slides by. This was the picture of American luxury. For decades, if you wanted to eat like a king in this country, you did not book a table in a city. You bought a ticket and you boarded a train. Now, look at the door the waiter keeps disappearing through. Because everything on that beautiful table came out of the other side of it. And on the other side of that swinging door was a kitchen the size of a closet, staffed by black men working 18-hour days in heat and noise and constant motion, who were not permitted to sit down in the very room they were feeding. They ate standing up, if they ate at all. And here is the part the railroad never printed on a menu. They were better than the famous restaurants on solid ground. Not as good. Better. For the better part of a century, the finest dining in America was not in Manhattan or the French Quarter. It was traveling at 70 miles an hour, run by men whose names never made it onto a single menu. And the celebrated white restaurants they quietly humiliated never even knew they were losing to a kitchen you could not stand up straight inside. Today we are going to count our way through that story, from the smallest miracle to the largest, 12 things about the greatest restaurant this country ever had, the one that was always moving. We are going to show you how it worked, how good they really were, and how that genius eventually got off the train and rebuilt American food from the ground up. So let us open the door. Before we start, one promise about where this comes from, because it matters. We are not going to hand you a folk tale. This story lives in the record. It is in the Pullman Company's own archives, in surviving dining car menus, in railroad histories, and in the oral testimony of the men who worked the galley and the food historians who have spent careers documenting the dining car as a genuine culinary institution. The working conditions are heavily documented. The culinary standard is heavily documented. Where a specific detail is tradition or a reasonable reconstruction of how the men worked rather than a line we can point to in a ledger, we will tell you plainly. The story is remarkable enough that it does not need embroidering. Every load-bearing fact underneath it holds. So, we start at number 12, with the room itself. Number 12. The kitchen was smaller than your bathroom. Start with the space, because the space is the whole miracle. The galley in a rail dining car was a narrow slot of a room tucked at one end of the car, and by most surviving accounts, it was smaller than a modern home bathroom. Picture a corridor barely wide enough for one grown man to pass another sideways. Down one side ran the range, coal-fired in the early decades, later oil or electric, throwing off a wall of heat with almost nowhere for it to go, so that in summer the galley became an oven inside an oven, and the men worked it soaked through by the middle of the first seating. There was no refrigeration the way we know it. Cold came from blocks of ice, loaded at stations and packed into ice boxes that had to be managed like a scarce resource. Because when the ice was gone, it was gone until the next stop, and the next stop might be 100 miles down the line. The water came from tanks built into the car, a finite supply for cooking, washing, and cleaning across all those miles. So a cook learned to waste nothing, not a cup of water, not a scrap of trim. And above every surface were racks, hooks, and shelves, because there was no floor space to spare, so the kitchen went vertical. Every pot had a home. Every knife had a place. If you set something down in the wrong spot, you did not just make a mess, you broke the machine. That is really what this kitchen was, a machine tuned to a tolerance most restaurants never have to think about. A ground kitchen can be sloppy and survive it. You can send a runner to the walk in, you can shout for more space, you can spread out across a room. In the galley, there was no walk in, no back room, no more space anywhere on earth, because you were sealed inside a steel box crossing a continent with only the ice and the water and the food you had loaded that morning. The men who worked it did not have the luxury of clutter or the luxury of a bad day. They built a system where a closet outperformed rooms 10 times its size, and they did it because the constraint left them no other choice. And consider what that closet was expected to produce with. A single dining car might carry a full inventory of china, glassware, and silver, each line stamping its own crest into the porcelain and the flatware, so a passenger knew at a glance which railroad was feeding them. There were linens for every table, fresh flowers where the budget allowed, a pantry stocked before departure for a route that could run 1,000 miles between good markets. All of it had to be stored, secured against the sway of the car, cleaned, and turned over between seatings in a space with no room to store anything. A restaurant on the ground can let the dishes pile up and deal with them at close. The galley had to run its own dishwashing in the same cramped slot where it cooked. In water, it could not replace until the next tank fill, while the next wave of orders was already coming through the door. The elegance the passengers saw on the table was not despite that closet. It came straight out of it, and out of the men who refused to let the size of the room become an excuse. Number 11. A handful of men ran the whole thing like a pit crew. Now put people in that closet. A dining car might carry a chef and a small brigade of cooks, often around 4 men working the galley at once, with a team of waiters moving through the swinging door in a steady relay. 4 men, in a room where 2 is a crowd, feeding a car that seated dozens and turned over into the hundreds across a single service, because passengers did not all eat at once. They came in seatings, waves of them, and the moment one wave cleared, the next was already sitting down. So the kitchen never truly stopped from the first breakfast call to the last dinner plate scraped clean near midnight. There is only one way that works, and it is choreography. Every man had his station and his lane, and the lanes could not cross, because a collision in that space did not mean an apology, it meant a dropped tray and a ruined service in front of paying eyes. So they moved like a pit crew. 1 man on the range, 1 on prep, 1 plating, 1 calling and expediting. Hands passing dishes over shoulders in a rhythm they could hold for 18 hours because the rhythm was the only thing keeping the chaos out. The steward worked the floor and kept the accounts, the waiters ran the relay through the swinging door, and the whole car operated as a single organism with the galley as its heart. Watch old footage of a busy professional kitchen at full tilt, and you get a hint of it, that near dance of bodies who know exactly where everyone else is, without ever looking up. Now shrink the room until it is a hallway. Now start the room moving. That is what these men did, every single service. And they made it look effortless to the person on the other side of the door, which was exactly the point of the whole performance. And remember that these men did not clock out and go home at night. They lived on the train for the length of the run, sleeping in cramped quarters at the end of the car or wherever space could be found, on call for the next meal almost before they had finished cleaning up the last one. A run could stretch for days across the country, which meant the 18-hour day was not a single bad shift, but the ordinary shape of the job repeated until the train reached the far terminal and turned around to do it all again. There was no going home to rest and reset. The kitchen was the job, and the home and the whole world for the length of the line. And the standard never dropped because the men were tired, because the passengers had paid for a standard and did not care how little the men behind the door had slept.
Before we continue, I want to show you something amazing. We put together a simple guide for the people who really care about these stories. Because whether we're talking about old school food forgotten trade, one truth remains the same. History is disappearing. This is for anyone who believes these memories, these lessons, these ways of life are still worth keeping. You can find it in the link in the description below, or you can scan the QR code right here.
Number 10. They cooked at 70 miles an hour. Here is the detail people forget, and it is the one that turns skill into something close to art. This kitchen was never still. The train was rocking, swaying, braking, and pitching over rough track the entire time. A pot of stock on the range was a pot of stock that wanted to slide. A knife on a board was cutting on a surface that would not hold flat. A plate carried through the door was a plate crossing the gap between two moving cars. Over the open couplings, with the ground blurring past below the vestibule, and the wind pulling at the waiter's jacket as he stepped across to join with both hands full. Think about what that does to technique. On solid ground, a cook relies on stillness. Liquid stays where you pour it. A stack holds. A sauce reduces in a pan that does not move. In the galley, none of that was guaranteed, so the men engineered around it. Pots were secured. Racks had rails. Movement was timed to the motion of the train. And by tradition, the best of them could feel a curve coming and brace for it before the car leaned into it, shifting their weight the way a sailor does without thinking about it. This is the part we mark honestly as reconstruction. The feel of it. Because you cannot ledger a man's balance or the memory in his knees. But the demand was real and documented. They were producing delicate, multi-course, restaurant-grade food inside a vehicle that was actively trying to spill it. And they lost so little that the passenger up front never suspected the fight going on behind the door. A steady hand is impressive in a still kitchen. In a moving one, it is a kind of genius that most trained chefs today have never once had to summon. The strange thing about a genius like that is where it lived. It did not live on paper. There was no manual that taught a man how to feel a curve in his knees or how to plate 100 covers in a hallway on a rocking floor. That knowledge lived in the hands, and it moved the only way that kind of knowledge ever moves, from one man to the next, by working the line beside him until the younger one could feel it too. Which is exactly the kind of knowledge that vanishes when a generation goes and no one thought to write it down. That is the whole reason the Grandma Made Away Kitchen Collection exists. Not as a product, but as a way of keeping that hand-to-hand kitchen knowledge in one place before it leaves with the people who carry it. The technique that was never on paper, gathered and held. The link is in the description below, and it is worth your time. Now, back to the food. Number 9. Everything came out from scratch, exactly the same every time. We tend to assume a kitchen under that much pressure would cut corners. The opposite was true. The standard was not just high, it was fixed. A passenger boarding in one city and a passenger boarding 1,000 miles later were supposed to receive the same dish, plated the same way, tasting the same. Because the meal was a promise the railroad had made, and the cooks were the ones who had to keep it. Without exception, without an off night, without ever letting the passenger see the seams. So they made it from scratch. Sauces built up in the galley, not poured from a jar. Breads and rolls turned out fresh, sometimes baked through the night for the morning service, so the smell of them was already in the car when the first passenger stirred. Meats broken down and cooked to order, and the ingredients told you where you were, because the good lines sourced along the route, taking on fresh catch, produce, and regional specialties as the tracks crossed from one part of the country into another. So the food shifted under you as the landscape did outside the glass. They did all of it to a consistency that a modern chain, with all its industrial help and its climate-controlled kitchens, still struggles to match. No two nights on the ground are ever quite the same in a normal kitchen. On the rails, they had to be, because the brand depended on it and the men had been told, in effect, that failure was simply not on the menu. Consistency at that level is not a small thing. It is the hardest thing in professional cooking, the thing that separates a good cook from a great kitchen. And a crew of 4 pulled it off in a closet, in motion, for decades, without the customer ever seeing the effort it cost them. Picture just the breakfast service to feel the scale of it. A full car of passengers waking hungry within the same hour, every one of them wanting eggs cooked their own particular way, toast, fresh coffee. A hot plate carried the length of a moving train and set down still steaming. Eggs to order for 100 people is a nightmare in a still kitchen with a big flat griddle and a room to move in. The galley did it on a range the size of a stove you might have at home, in a corridor, on a rocking floor, and it did it fast enough that no one waited long enough to complain. Then it cleaned down and started again for lunch and again for dinner. 3 full restaurant services a day, out of a room you could not turn around in, holding a standard high enough to shame the competition. Say that plainly and it sounds impossible. The men made it routine. Number 8. The railroad lost money on the food on purpose. This is where the story turns. So slow down with us for a second. You would assume a dining car was a business, something the railroad ran to turn a profit on hungry travelers. It was not. By the accounts of railroad historians, dining service across the major lines routinely ran at a loss, year after year, and the companies knew it, and they kept doing it anyway, decade after decade. The dining car was a loss leader. It did not exist to make money on food. It existed to sell the entire railroad. Follow the logic, because it is the engine under everything else. A ticket buyer choosing between competing lines could not easily tell one set of tracks from another. Steel is steel in a schedule, and a schedule is a schedule. What they could tell was how they were treated on board. So, the meal became the advertisement, the one thing a railroad could offer that a rival could not simply copy overnight, and the one memory a traveler carried home and repeated to everyone who would listen. The linen, the silver, the 5 courses, all of it was the company buying a reputation for luxury, and that reputation was worth far more than the money the kitchen bled every mile. Which means the food could not merely be good. It had to be spectacular, better than what that same traveler could get in the finest room in their own city, or the whole expensive gamble did not pay off. The company set the bar at impossible and then walked away from the stove. And the men in the galley, the black cooks the railroad paid as little as it could, are the ones who had to reach it. They did not just reach it. They embarrassed the competition, and that is the next one down. Number 7. A closet outcooked the famous rooms on the ground. Here is the humiliation the title promised, and it is not an exaggeration. When the railroad set that impossible standard, the men in the galley met it so completely that the dining car stopped being merely good and became a measuring stick. Travelers who could afford to eat anywhere, the people who dined in the celebrated restaurants of the era, came off the trains talking about the food on the rails as the best they had eaten anywhere, on the ground or off it. Certain lines built national fame on their tables alone, so that the railroad's name and a particular dish became inseparable in the public mind. The dishes coming out of that 4-man closet were held up against the grand rooms on solid ground, and the grand rooms did not always win. Sit with the shape of that. On one side of the door, a famous restaurant with a full basement kitchen, a staff of dozens, a still floor, a wine cellar, and a name in the newspaper. On the other side, 4 black men in a hallway on a moving train. No basement, no room, no name anywhere, working with block ice and a water tank and whatever the last station had to sell them. And the verdict of the people who ate both was that the hallway was cooking circles around the famous room. The white restaurants they were beating mostly never knew there was a contest at all. They were competing against a kitchen they could not see, run by men they would not have seated in their own dining rooms, and they were losing, quietly, meal after meal, for years. A kitchen the size of a closet, beating the best rooms in town. That is not a legend, anyone dressed up after the fact. That is what the diners said at the time, in their own letters and their own accounts. And the reputation was specific enough that people planned trips around it. There were lines whose dining service was so celebrated that travelers chose the railroad for the meal as much as the route, willing to pay more and sit longer for the chance to eat what those cars were putting out. When a company's food becomes a reason to buy the ticket, you are no longer talking about a nice touch on a long journey. You are talking about a restaurant that happens to have a train attached to it and a kitchen that is carrying the whole brand on its back. That is the position these men were put in, and they carried it. Number 6. They did not just win once. They set the national standard. The single-service humiliation is the fun part. The bigger truth is heavier. This was not one great meal on one great night. The rail kitchens became a benchmark, and that benchmark shaped what Americans came to expect fine dining to be. Different lines became famous for different things. The eastern roads that ran toward the Chesapeake became known for their seafood. The northern lines that crossed cold rivers became known for their trout. Others built reputations on game, on regional cooking, on breads and desserts that travelers wrote home about and asked after for years afterward. A whole generation of Americans with money learned what excellent looked like on a train. And when they sat down in a restaurant afterward, that train was the standard sitting in the back of their minds, the quiet yardstick every other kitchen was being measured against, whether it knew it or not. So the men in the galley were not just beating individual restaurants. They were quietly teaching the entire country what to want. They were doing the work of a national culinary school without a building, without accreditation, without their names on any of it, exporting a standard of fresh, consistent, regional, beautifully served food into the expectations of everyone who could afford a ticket. The influence ran outward from that closet in every direction the rails did, which by the peak was very nearly everywhere in America, into every city the tracks touched and every town they paused in. Think about the reach of that before we move on. The taste of a whole traveling class, shaped from inside a room a man could not even turn around in. If this is landing for you, if you have never once thought about the door at the end of a dining car, until right now, do us a small favor and subscribe. We tell the stories of the people American history was happy to eat from and unwilling to name. And there is a great deal more of this coming. Now back to the galley, because from here the countdown gets harder. Number 5. The men who made the meal could not sit at the table. Everything we have described so far has a shadow over it, and it is time to name it directly. The black cooks and waiters who produced the finest dining in America were, in that same era, barred from eating in the rooms they served, on the trains that carried them, in the towns where they stopped, in the country they were feeding. The men whose hands built that entire experience of luxury were not welcome to sit inside it as guests. They ate standing up in the galley, in the gaps between seatings, in the little slivers of time the work allowed. On the wrong side of a door they were never invited through except to carry someone else's plate to someone else's table. Hold both pictures at once, because the whole story lives in the gap between them. On one side of the swinging door, a passenger is being handed the best meal of their life on white linen and told, in effect, that this is what dignity feels like. On the other side of the same door, in the very same instant, the man who cooked it is eating on his feet in a hallway, because the room he just fed has no chair for him in it and never will. Same door, same moment. Two different Americas separated by a few inches of swinging wood. That door is the entire story, and these men lived on the wrong side of it every hour of every shift, for years, for whole careers, and then handed the apron to a son or a nephew who would live on the wrong side of it too. And it was not only the galley door. For much of this era, the dining car itself operated under the rules of a segregated country. In many places, and for many years, Black passengers who wanted to eat in the same car the black cooks were running could be seated only behind a curtain at the end tables, screened off from the white diners, as though the sight of them eating would spoil the meal. So the men in the galley cooked for a room that would not seat them, on trains that would not seat people who looked like them, without a partition, in a country that had built the indignity into the furniture. They kept the standard anyway, not because the country had earned it from them, but because the work was theirs and they refused to let it be less than excellent, whatever the room thought of the men who made it. Number 4. Paid the least, credited never, stripped even of their names. Follow the money and the pattern gets uglier and more familiar. The railroad sold luxury, banked the reputation the food earned, and paid the men who produced it as little as it could manage. Wages were thin. By the surviving records, dining car and Pullman workers often leaned heavily on tips, which meant their livelihood depended on pleasing the very passengers who were seated where the workers themselves could not sit. They were, in the plainest terms, the most skilled and the least credited people in the room. The line took the prestige. The men took home a wage the company kept small on purpose and made up the difference with a smile they could not afford to drop. And it went past money into something more personal. The erasure was built right into how they were addressed. The Pullman porters, the men who ran the sleeping cars alongside the dining crews, were so routinely stripped of their individual names that white passengers simply called them all George, after George Pullman, the man who owned the company, as if the men were extensions of his property rather than people with names and families of their own. The dining car men lived inside that same machine of anonymity. We want to be careful here, because it would be easy to reach for a single villain, and the truth is quieter and worse than a villain. This was not a secret plot hatched in a back room. It was the ordinary machinery of a country that was perfectly happy to eat the food and perfectly unwilling to name the cook. No one man in a top hat designed the whole injustice by himself. It was simply how the system was built to run, and it ran that way for generations without anyone in charge ever feeling they had to explain it or apologize for it. But the men did not simply accept it forever. And this is a part of the story worth holding on to. In the 1920s, the porters and dining car men organized under A. Philip Randolph. They built the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and after a long and bitter fight, it became one of the first black-led labor unions to win a real contract with a major American company. The men who had been called George and paid on tips organized themselves into a force the railroad had to sit across a table from and negotiate with. That fight did not undo the indignity overnight, and we will not pretend it did, but it planted people and lessons that would matter far beyond the rails in a movement for civil rights still years down the track. The men behind the door were not only cooks and waiters. Some of them were organizers, and the country would feel it later. The answer to all of this is not resentment, and it is not a lecture. The answer is the one thing the country would not do at the time. It is finally saying the names. Number 3. So say their names. Start with Rufus Estes. For a story about men whose names never made a menu, we can at least put one firmly on the record, because he put himself there. Rufus Estes was born enslaved around the late 1850s, and he became a cook on the rails in the era when the great dining cars were taking their finished shape. And then he did something almost no one in his position was ever able to do. He wrote it down. In 1911, he published a cookbook of his own, gathering his recipes and the story of his life between two covers, and it stands today as one of the earliest cookbooks written and published by an African-American chef, by a man who had begun his life owned by another human being and ended it as an author. That book is a door someone propped open on purpose, so the knowledge would not die quietly with the man who held it. Estes is one name we can hold, but understand that he stands in for thousands we cannot. Behind him is a whole profession of black chefs and cooks and waiters who ran these kitchens across every major line for the better part of a century, and whose names the record mostly did not bother to keep. We say his name so that the others do not stay abstract, so that they read as men and not as a category or a caption under an old photograph. Every fact in this countdown, the closet, the pit crew ballet, the cooking at speed, the standard that beat the famous rooms, was accomplished by specific men with specific hands who came to work in the dark and left in the dark, and were not thanked by name for any of it. Rufus, Estes, we can name. The rest, we can at least refuse to forget, which is its own small kind of justice. And when you go looking, the record gives up a little more than you expect if you are willing to read past the label on the photograph. A chef listed by first name only in a company file. A waiter remembered in a family for the way he folded a napkin or carved at the table. A cook whose recipe outlived him in a household that never knew where he had learned it. The names were not lost because they did not exist. They were lost because no one in charge thought they were worth writing down. That is a choice a country made, and it is a choice we can start to unmake. One name at a time. Number 2, the genius got off the train and it did not stay quiet. Here is where the story stops being only a tragedy, because these men did not vanish when the golden age of the rails faded. For all its exploitation, dining car and Pullman work was, in that era, one of the very few stable paths a black man had to a steady wage, to travel across a country that was largely closed to him, to a measure of standing in his own community, and above all, to a real portable skill. And a skill is the one thing you can carry off a train and no one can take from you at the gate. When the men left the rails, whether they aged out, moved on, or watched the passenger trains decline as the automobile and the airplane took over the country, they did not leave the technique behind in the galley. They took it with them in their hands. And then it spread. Former rail cooks opened their own restaurants. They ran hotel kitchens in the cities they settled in. They cooked in institutions and homes and dining rooms all over the country. And above all, they trained the people who came up behind them, passing along the same hand-to-hand knowledge in the same old way by working the line beside someone until it finally took hold. The standard that had been trapped inside a moving closet got out and scattered across the whole country, seeding fine dining and everyday excellence into kitchens that had no idea where the technique had come from or whose hands had first perfected it under such impossible conditions. The best restaurant in America did not close when the dining cars went dark. It broke apart into 1,000 pieces and kept right on cooking, under 1,000 different roofs, feeding people who would never know the debt they were sitting down to. That kind of knowledge, the hand-to-hand kind that the rail cooks carried and that was never written down anywhere official, is exactly what the Grandma Made Away Kitchen Collection was built to protect, not to sell you something, to keep the technique that lives in a family's hands from leaving with the generation that holds it, gathered and saved in one place before it is gone for good. If any of this has moved you, the link is in the description below, and that is where to go. Now, the last one, the one that outlasts everyone in the story. Number 1. The debt is still on the table, which brings us to the top of the countdown, the thing that outlives every man in it. The standard those men set did not die with them. It is folded into what Americans still expect when they sit down to something excellent. The freshness of it, the consistency, the sense that the room was built to take care of you, and that someone unseen has thought of everything. A great deal of that inheritance traces back, directly and indirectly, through the men who learned it in a hallway on a moving train and carried it into everything they touched for the rest of their lives. American fine dining owes a debt to cooks who were never once, in all those long years, allowed to sit down and enjoy the very thing they had perfected with their own 2 hands. And notice what the inheritance actually was. It was never the paycheck, because the railroad made certain the paycheck stayed small. It was the skill. The one thing the company could not underpay them for, could not claw back at the end of a shift, could not keep locked on the wrong side of the door, was what they knew how to do with their hands. That left the train with them, and only them. That is the part they owned outright, free and clear, and it is the part they passed down. These men were exploited, and we will not pretend otherwise for the sake of a tidier ending. But the point of this whole story is not that they were victims, though they were. The point is that they were so extraordinarily good that a rolling closet outcooked the finest rooms in the entire country. And the proof of it is still sitting on your plate tonight, whether you know their names or not. So we want to hand this back to you, because a lot of you are closer to this story than you think. Some of you had a father, an uncle, a grandfather who worked the rails, a Pullman man, a dining car cook, a waiter in a white jacket who came home tired and proud, and he brought back stories and a way of doing things in the kitchen that never quite left the family. If that is you, say his name here. Tell us who worked the trains in your family, and tell us what he brought home to your kitchen, the dish, the trick, the standard he would not let anyone in the house lower. We read those, and every single name is one more the record does not get to lose. And if this opened a door for you, we have another one waiting just behind it. Next, we are going into the brands you buy every week that were built on black cooking and never said so out loud, the faces printed on the boxes and the recipes underneath them. That story is coming soon, and you're going to want to see who is really behind the label. Because in the end, it comes down to this. The best restaurant America ever had was not a building at all. It was a kitchen the size of a closet, moving at 70 miles an hour, run by men who were not allowed to sit down in the rooms they were feeding. They cooked this country's finest meals on the wrong side of a swinging door, and the country ate every last bite and never learned their names. It is long past time we opened that door, and it is long past time we said their names out loud.